I stood up from the dinner table, pulled out the only photo left of the three of us, faded now with time, and said, "The last time we were a family was in this picture. Everything after was just performance." This is the story of how I was erased by my own son, and how I chose not to shout but to rise. If you've ever been quietly replaced, forgotten, or underestimated, stay with me. This isn't a story of revenge. It's a story of truth finding its way back. My name is Irene Calloway. I was a mother, a soldier, and for a long time I was silent, but not anymore. They called it a fainting spell. I was in the kitchen preparing tea like I had 1,000 mornings before when the room tilted just slightly. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't crash to the ground or cry out. I simply lowered myself onto the floor, palms flat on the cold tile, and waited for it to pass. When it did, I reached for the counter, pulled myself up, and thought, well, that was strange, but not terrifying. Not worth telling anyone, or so I thought. Derek, my only son, thought otherwise. When I mentioned it in passing during one of our brief phone calls, more like check-ins, really, he went quiet. The next morning he was at my door, not with flowers or concern, but with an agenda. "We're going for a drive, Mom," he said, like it was a casual outing. An hour later, we pulled into the circular driveway of a pristine facility with manicured shrubs and flags that never drooped, the kind of place brochures call serene and dignified. I wasn't afraid. Not yet. I'd seen retirement homes before. I'd even volunteered in one when I was younger, stationed between deployments. But the way Derek was walking ahead of me, not beside me, made something twist in my chest. He didn't ask me if I liked the place. He didn't walk me back out to the car. Instead, he handed over a folder to the receptionist, kissed my forehead like a nurse would a patient, and said, "You'll be safe here, Mom. You need real care now. This is better for you." Then he left. That was the last time I saw his face in person. The first week I told myself he was busy. The second that maybe something had come up with work, or Marissa, his wife, who never quite warmed to me. By the third week, the silence started to take root, the kind that fills the corners of your thoughts, the space where love used to live. I wasn't used to feeling useless. For 30 years I had worn a uniform that didn't tolerate uselessness. I had led field logistics in unstable territories, managed crisis evacuations, translated strategic communications across 3 continents. I'd memorized escape routes, not casserole recipes. But none of that seemed to matter now. The facility was clean, quiet, and utterly without warmth. The staff was professional, kind even, but kindness without familiarity is just protocol. My room had a window overlooking a courtyard where no one ever sat. My meals arrived on time. My medication was tracked. I was given puzzles and pamphlets about aging gracefully, and every birthday like clockwork I'd get a message from Marissa, "Happy birthday, Irene. Hope you're doing well. Rest is what you deserve. Not love, not warmth. Just the word rest, like I'd been put into storage." I tried not to let it eat at me. I tried to play along. Smile during morning stretches, ask about the weather, pretend to enjoy peach cobbler on Sundays. But inside, I felt hollow, like someone had folded me up and placed me in a drawer marked, "Done." Then, one afternoon, something odd happened. A nurse named Carla, a sharp-eyed woman with a Brooklyn accent and zero tolerance for nonsense, came into my room with a furrowed brow. "Miss Calloway," she said, holding a clipboard, "I'm trying to confirm some things with the system and, well, it says here your military pension has been paused, flagged for audit." I blinked, paused. "What does that mean?" She shook her head. "Might be a clerical error, or sometimes it happens when there's a status change." "What kind of status?" Carla hesitated. "Mental competency, just a formality usually. But yours? It's got a file marker attached. I asked to see it. She wasn't supposed to show me, but she liked rules about as much as I did when they made no sense. What she showed me made the room tilt again. Not from age, not from illness, but from the kind of disbelief that grabs your spine. A digital record. My name, my service ID, flagged as psychologically unfit for continued benefits, filed under the Defense Department's internal code, signed and submitted by Derek Calloway. My son. I stared at it for a long time, not because I didn't understand what I was reading, but because I understood it too well. Derek hadn't just left me here. He'd erased me from the life I had earned. He hadn't called me unstable to my face. He hadn't told me he thought I was too old to manage my affairs. He had just entered it into a system and let the machine do the forgetting. I sat on the edge of the bed that night, watching the moonlight fall across the linoleum. The documents Carla showed me were just the beginning, I knew that. I'd lived in systems. I'd studied their weaknesses. And if someone wanted me gone, this paper trail was how they did it. He hadn't destroyed me. He'd redacted me. And the worst part, I almost let it happen. I almost accepted the lie that I was done, that I was no longer needed. But silence is a powerful teacher. And I had been quiet long enough. The next morning, I asked Carla for access to the shared computer lab. She raised a brow. "You planning on starting a blog?" "Not quite," I said, tying my hair back with the precision that had once made sergeants hold their breath. I wasn't planning on talking. I was planning on logging in. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was something quieter, more dangerous. A kind of stillness that settles deep in your bones when you realize you've been put in a box and labeled no longer relevant. But I knew better. I didn't leave life. They shut the door. That night, after seeing the file Derek had submitted, I sat in the common room while the other residents watched a rerun of Wheel of Fortune. I stared out the window at the bare branches scratching at the glass, and in my mind, I began building a list, not of accusations, but of questions. Quiet, careful questions. By the end of the week, I had a full notebook, and then, like a hand reaching through fog, came Vega. She and I had served together during Operation North Range. She ran satellite logistics, I handled contingency structuring. We hadn't spoken in over a decade, not since her early retirement. But when I sent a cryptic message through an old secure line asking only for a conversation, her response came in less than an hour. Sending you a temporary access pass. 1 hour only. Storage node. Echo 9. Use it wisely. No sentiment. Just trust. The next day during my designated recreation hour, I signed into the community room's outdated computer station. While most residents used it to email grandchildren or search for recipes they no longer cooked, I launched a legacy system buried beneath obsolete interfaces. Echo 9 came online with a flicker. The database wasn't beautiful. Just raw text, old PDFs, image scans. But it was all there. Strategy memos, declassified operation outlines, archived doctrine drafts. I searched my own name. Nothing. Not a trace. I tried a different angle. Searching for familiar phrases, linguistic markers I had always embedded into my field reports. Stylometric fingerprints. That's when I found them. Files I knew by heart. Doctrine structures I had sweated over in the field, ideas refined under duress, tested during live operations. But every one of them had a different author. D. Calloway. The initials didn't surprise me. What made my stomach turn was the subtlety, the way my exact phrases had been rephrased just enough to pass off as new. A strategic reimagining, they might call it. But it was theft. And it wasn't sloppy. It was deliberate. I dug further. There was a sudden gap in archival records. Precisely at the time I was transferred from active operations to the Reserve Liaison Unit, a bureaucratic holding cell where careers go to die. The timestamp on my deletion file. 2 weeks after Derek's promotion to Deputy Policy Officer at the Pentagon, I leaned back in the chair. The hum of the heating vents felt louder now. I closed the screen and stared at the floor where the vinyl tile was worn in the shape of countless wheelchair turns and slow, shuffled feet. He hadn't just pushed me aside to rise. He had stepped over me. Back in my room, I sat at the edge of the bed and opened the bottom drawer of my nightstand. Inside, I kept a box of old letters, the kind people stopped sending after smartphones became the norm. Among them, buried under yellowing Christmas cards and birthday notes from colleagues long since gone, was one envelope marked in Derek's handwriting. I'd never opened it, not because I didn't care, but because I'd always known, deep down, that it wasn't going to be an apology. I was right. Mom, this isn't personal. I just need to lead, not inherit. That was all it said. No greeting. No warmth. Just a mission statement. A boundary. I stared at the words for a long time. Not inherit. As if my existence, my service, my name, was some kind of burden he had to carry. As if being my son had stained him with expectation. I remembered the look in his eyes during his commissioning ceremony, how stiff he stood next to me, how he introduced me not as Mom, but Colonel Irene Calloway, retired. He had never wanted to share the stage, and so eventually he pushed me off it. There's a wordless pain in being deleted. It's not loud like betrayal. It's quiet like shame, because you start to wonder if you made it too easy. I hadn't spoken about my career much. Not with him, not even with Marissa. I'd buried medals in drawers, kept certificates in storage. I didn't want to loom over him like some myth he had to outshine. I told myself I was giving him space. But I see now, what I really did was erase myself, first hoping he'd fill the space with respect. Instead, he mistook it for absence and used it. That night, I pulled out an old photograph. Derek, at age 7, face still full of wonder, holding a paper airplane he insisted on calling his prototype. I'd taken the picture after returning from a 3-month deployment. He ran to the car, arms outstretched, shouting, "Mommy's home." My heart clenched. I didn't step away from life. I stepped back for him. And somewhere along the line, he took that step as an invitation to close the door behind me. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. People assume that when you go quiet, you've given up. They see the stillness, the withdrawn gaze, the polite nods. And they think you've accepted your place in the background. What they don't realize is that some of us were trained to operate in silence. That's where strategy is born, not in the shouting, but in the quiet recalibration of truth. After I found that my military pension was quietly being revoked and that Derek had erased my service from the official system, I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I did what I had always done when under siege. I got to work. I began slowly. Mornings in the care facility were predictable. Nurse checks, physical therapy I didn't need. A round of community engagement activities that felt more like a holding pattern for people waiting out the end. But I wasn't waiting. After breakfast, I would ask for my old composition notebook. The nurses thought it was for memory training. They smiled and nodded and said it was good to keep the mind active. They had no idea I was reconstructing field strategies from 2 decades ago. By hand, from memory. Every tactical deployment I'd ever orchestrated, every asymmetric maneuver I'd run in training simulations, I began writing them down again. Not because I needed to prove it to myself, but because someone else needed to see it couldn't be faked. I forced myself to remember details I hadn't accessed in years. Call signs, perimeter grids, the logic threads I used to design response systems in desert environments or blackout zones. I diagrammed them in colored pencils borrowed from the rec room, blending tactic with instinct, like I had when I first drew them on dirt with a stick beside a downed signal tower in '04. There's something humbling about starting over with nothing but your mind. But I wasn't rebuilding out of ego. I was gathering proof. Truth in my world is only as strong as the paper it's written on. That's when Vega reached out again. Vega was one of the few still inside the system who hadn't forgotten me. She'd been a specialist on my team during my final deployment, sharp as glass and twice as dangerous. We'd fallen out of touch after my exit, not by choice, but by circumstance. Her message came through a low-priority channel disguised as a birthday greeting. Inside the attached link was a shell code. Happy birthday. You'll know what to do with this. I waited until lights out to run the file. The drive she sent carried a bare-bones version of a system I had long thought destroyed Echo protocol. A forensic trace engine I built back in the mid-2000s, originally as a quiet safeguard against tactical plagiarism within classified networks. At the time, no one cared about attribution. We were soldiers, not authors, they said. But I knew better. In wartime, strategy is authorship, and stolen strategy costs lives. So I built a system to find patterns, to track specific syntax structures, response logic, the fingerprints behind command decisions, things that couldn't be faked, not easily. When I left the military, Echo Protocol vanished with me. Or so I thought. Vega had found the code embedded inside a retired signal library during a recent software patch audit. She rebuilt it patched in a visual interface and handed it back like a matchbook in a gas leak. I stared at the interface for a long time before activating it. Then I began feeding it the doctrines I remembered. One by one, every tactical white paper I'd ever ghostwritten or co-authored under layers of hierarchy. I entered mission identifiers' field strategy names, even the ones I'd unofficially trained new officers on, without ever seeing credit. The engine began flagging patterns. The first few pings came from documents I already suspected. Strategic response frameworks filed under Derek Calloway's name, formally submitted the same month I was marked as mentally unfit for continued command. The language was almost identical to mine, just rewritten in civilian sanitized phrasing. I scrolled through with a hollow ache in my chest, but then something shifted. The system began flagging deeper anomalies, doctrines that weren't just stolen from me. They'd been lifted from others too, women I had served with, women I respected. I fed in one of Alice Montoya's last tactical doctrines, a circular suppression model she'd designed while stationed in Ramadi. It now showed up under a male lieutenant's name cited in recent War College lectures. Then I fed in Beatrice Leclerc's counterinsurgency interface model. Same result. At first I thought it was coincidence, a coding error, but the system flagged something else. Repetition in the timing. Each of these reassignments occurred within 6 months of the original author's early retirement medical leave or discharge under disputed psychological assessments. It wasn't just me. It was systemic, a pattern of quiet erasure, of brilliant women removed just early enough, just quietly enough to make space for others to claim what they had built. I opened a new document and began mapping the web. I labeled it Strategic Disappearance Index. Each entry had a date, a doctrine name, a flag for authorship reassignment, and a cross-reference to personnel reports. I worked every night, sometimes until my hands cramped. Other residents slept. I stayed up with a thermos of cold coffee and the soft hum of the ventilator nearby. Each line I wrote was a lifeline, a rope back to a version of myself that had been deliberately buried. What frightened me wasn't just the theft, it was how invisible the theft had become. These weren't dramatic takeovers. They were quiet. Silent reshuffling. Remove the original. Scrub the name. Repackage the idea. Redirect the citation. Wait for the dust to settle. When you're in the business of silence long enough, you start to notice how it's used as a weapon. One night I printed out my own evaluation file. The one Derek had signed. Subject deemed unfit for extended command due to psychological instability. I read the words again out loud in the dark. Unfit. I whispered it slowly like it might bite back. And then I looked at the line that came next, Recommendation Command Reassignment, Pending Review. Signed Lieutenant Colonel D. Calloway. My own son had not just walked away from me. He had profited from my deletion. I closed the file and turned off the lamp. In the glass reflection of my dark window, I caught a glimpse of myself. Not old, not frail, not forgotten, but preparing. There's a kind of defiance that doesn't make noise. It doesn't slam doors or make speeches. It moves like water, quiet but unstoppable, carving stone where fire fails. That's the kind of resistance I learned to practice. Not because I lacked courage, but because the world always listened harder when I said nothing and simply acted. Activating Echo Protocol wasn't a decision made in anger. It was a decision made in clarity. Once I had enough patterns flagged and enough evidence rebuilt from memory and data, Traces, Vega, and I ran the system live. We fed it directly into the encrypted internal ethics server through a silent protocol designed for unregistered reviews. Not whistleblowing, not accusation, just a breadcrumb trail that the system couldn't unsee once it began following. The trigger was simple doctrinal irregularity detected in authorship sequencing. The result was less simple. Within 48 hours, the first internal ping was registered inside the Department of Strategic Operations. Doctrines from 2003 to 2014 were quietly flagged for stylistic review. No alerts went public, but I could feel the system shifting, like a submarine turning in deep water, invisible on the surface but churning everything beneath. By day 3, 2 doctrines had been queued for audit. Both were foundational tactical blueprints widely taught across 3 branches of the military. Both bore the name Lieutenant Colonel Derek Calloway. But Echo Protocol's algorithm had traced linguistic fingerprints to a different origin. Me. I didn't gloat. Instead, I wrote a single sentence in my notebook underlined 3 times. It's not revenge, it's recognition. That morning, Derek felt the shift too. I imagine he first noticed when his regular clearance login threw an unexpected delay. A message. Routine audit in progress. Please verify authorship chain. That's the kind of warning that triggers the fight-or-flight reflex in anyone operating at the top of a fabricated ladder. At 11:07 a.m., my phone rang. For the first time in nearly a decade, the name Derek Calloway appeared on the screen of my room's outdated landline. It blinked like a warning light. Not because I feared what he'd say, but because I knew exactly why he was calling. He wasn't calling as a son. He was calling as a man who'd just heard a system whisper back a name he thought was dead and buried. I didn't answer. Let it ring, I thought, staring at the screen until the sound blurred into the hum of the radiator behind me. Eventually, the line fell quiet. He didn't leave a voicemail, but he didn't need to. The silence told me everything. Later that night, I opened the secure channel Vega had built into the Echo interface. It wasn't just a tracker anymore. It had become a mirror. She was already online. 2 more doctrines flagged, she typed. You're lighting up the review board without saying a word. I smiled. Not out of pride, but relief. This wasn't about being loud. It was about being undeniable. I opened a blank internal memorandum on the server. Nothing traceable, no title, no recipient, just a floating file inside the anonymous log pool. Officers use it when they don't want to risk backlash. It's often filled with concern reports, ethical flags, and quiet cries from those who no longer trust their chain of command. I typed only 1 line. You buried me, but the ground remembers. No name, no timestamp, no demand, just the truth still warm enough to sting. It was submitted into the system's ethics archive before midnight. The next day, Vega met me in person. She walked into the care center like she belonged there. Clipboard in hand, hair pulled back, dressed in civilian gray. But beneath her calm exterior was the familiar spark I'd trusted during black site operations and rapid evac drills. Vega wasn't just competent, she was surgical. You've kicked up more dust in 3 days than most officers do in an entire career, she said, closing the door behind her. They're nervous. Audit teams are moving. Eyes are landing where no one's looked in years. I nodded. Let the system audit itself. She studied me carefully. Are you planning to go public? The question didn't surprise me. The world now practically expected whistleblowers to be loud, emotional, theatrical. To take to the stage and rip open every scar in the name of justice. But that was never my way. I don't want to shout, I said. I want them to read the truth. even when I say nothing." Vega tilted her head. "You want to be visible." "Exactly." For too long, silence had been mistaken for surrender, but in my hands it had become something else. A tool, a blade sharpened slowly, deliberately, in a world where the loudest often drown out the wisest. In that quiet room with the sunlight cutting through the blinds and the faint sounds of hallway bingo in the distance, I felt more in control than I had in years. "I'm not staging a revolt," I said. "I'm just letting the record reflect what already happened." Vega leaned back in her chair. "You're doing more than that." I met her gaze. Maybe I said softly, "But they'll never be able to say they didn't see it coming." There are moments in life when the world stops pretending it doesn't know who you are. That day arrived quietly for me, wrapped in layers of routine and formality like most things in the defense world. But I had waited long enough. I no longer needed an invitation to the table. I had built the doctrine it sat on. The annual Strategic Defense Summit was a staple in Washington. It brought together analysts, generals, think tank specialists, and politicians, all gathered under chandeliers to discuss war without ever using the word directly. This year's theme, Emerging Threats in Gray Zones. I knew the doctrine they'd base it on, because I'd written it. Not in a clean office or under flattering lights, but in a field tent in Central Asia, during a 4-month campaign that left scars none of them had seen. I wrote the first draft with a cracked wrist and my back against a steel crate after evacuating a civilian sector that no one else dared to enter. And I wrote it not for glory, but because no one else could get it right. Derek was scheduled as the keynote speaker. Lieutenant Colonel Derek Calloway, they called him, in the press architect of next-generation strategy. He had dressed the blueprint in polished language, rephrased my models, removed the mess of reality. That was his talent polishing what he did not build. I didn't plan to be there, until I got a call from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. General Roth. He was once my commanding officer, a man who'd seen both my silence and my precision under fire. The man who'd shaken my hand after Operation Indigo when the reporters weren't watching. "Irene," he said, voice still gravel even after retirement. "You're not forgotten. Some of us still know." He offered me a platform. No media blitz, no reveal, just, an opening speech. 10 minutes. My terms. I said yes, and I didn't tell a soul. Not even Vega. Some truths needed to walk in alone. The morning of the summit was cold, the kind of dry chill that made your lungs ache before your legs caught up. I wore the uniform I hadn't touched in almost a decade. Cleaned, pressed, 4 stars on the shoulder, not for decoration but for memory. I hadn't come to confront Derek. I came to reclaim something older than that authorship. The venue buzzed with energy. Velvet badges, press roped off behind red-lined security staff, nodding too stiffly. I passed through each checkpoint with ease. The clearance still existed in the system. Buried maybe, but never revoked. Backstage I waited behind the heavy black curtain, listening as the moderator welcomed the audience. Cameras rolled quietly from overhead. I heard my name only when they said it. A special opening address today from a woman whose service history needs no embellishment. Colonel Irene Calloway, retired. Former doctrine strategist for tactical operations across 5 continents. Please welcome her to the stage. I stepped into the light. For a moment, the room did nothing. Just silence, no applause, no cough. Just rows of suits and uniforms frozen like someone had accidentally pressed pause on reality. And then came the whisper. A soft rustle across the rows as people recognized the uniform, the name, the contradiction to every rumor that had said I'd disappeared, retired early, gone unfit. In a modest living room far from DC, my family was watching live. Derek's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Marissa gripped the armrest. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. I could feel their silence all the way from the screen. I approached the podium slowly, not performing, Not hurrying, just arriving, fully, completely, and undeniably present. My voice didn't need to rise. "Good morning," I said evenly. "We gather today to discuss the unseen. The places between peace and conflict, the thresholds that history forgets, but strategy must not." Behind me, a screen displayed the first doctrine slide. No listed author, no footnote. Just a title, Tactical Patterning in Non-Binary Conflict Zones. I paused, then continued. "We often attribute strategies to institutions, to task forces, to anonymous collectives. But systems do not invent ideas, people do." A low murmur rippled through the audience. These doctrines, I said, nodding toward the screen, were not born from theory. They came from loss, from field improvisation, from lives measured not in rank, but in resolve. In the broadcast, the camera cut to a close-up, tighter than expected. It captured my name tag, 4 stars. And beneath it, in crisp, unmistakable font, Calloway, Doctrine Architect. I let the silence sit, then added, "Some of the greatest strategies we've used in the last 20 years bear no official author, because the authors were erased. No accusation, no names." But I saw the shift. The senior brass in row 3 leaning forward, the defense ethics advisor raising an eyebrow, even the moderator tapping her pen nervously. I hadn't come to shame anyone. I had come to remind them that the system's memory could be rewritten. But truth had its own archive. Visibility is not vanity, I concluded. It is correction. And correction is not conflict. It is healing. I stepped back. No applause, just stillness. The kind that doesn't come from confusion, but from recognition. The kind that follows truth when it walks back into a room no one expected it to own. Backstage, I didn't linger. As I passed the staff corridor, I heard someone whisper to another aide. "She was never gone. We just weren't looking." They were right. I hadn't needed to be invited. Because the room, the very strategy guiding that room, was built from my words, my silence, my years. And now, finally, my name. There was no applause when I stepped down from the stage. Not because the room disagreed, but because truth has a way of silencing even the proudest mouths. And for once, silence felt like respect, not erasure. I didn't need their clapping. I had seen their faces. That subtle tilt of the head, the way they leaned forward and watched me leave, not because I was wearing stars on my shoulders, but because they finally saw what those stars had cost. In another time, I might have craved vindication. Now I just wanted accuracy. I walked down the side corridor of the venue without looking back. No cameras followed, no press blocked my path. Just the quiet sound of my boots on polished tile. Boots that still remembered how to move with purpose. The SUV waiting for me wasn't marked. Vega had arranged it, of course. She didn't speak when I slid into the back seat. She just glanced at me through the rearview mirror with that same familiar edge of pride she never voiced. "They're talking," she said, simply pulling away from the curb. "Let them," I replied. Back at the nursing home, my nameplate on the door hadn't changed. The world outside had begun to tilt, but inside those walls, the routines stayed fixed: 3 meals, 2 meds, and the occasional therapy dog visit. I sat at my window and watched the world adjust itself. But in other rooms I had once been shut out of, the real shifting had begun. That evening across town, Marissa yanked the television cord from the socket mid-broadcast. Her expression, tight lips drawn in disbelief. "She's not supposed to be." Derek didn't answer her. He stood frozen still in uniform from a morning he'd expected to own. The footage replayed in his mind. The uniform, the name tag, the doctrine. Calloway, Doctrine Architect. Not a whisper, not a side note, but front and center. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. The narrative was no longer his to control. For the first time in years, he wasn't the voice in the room. He was just an echo caught in a truth much older than his career. Within 24 hours, the ripples had turned into waves. Media outlets, especially those with defense correspondents, began raising quiet, cautious questions. Who was Colonel Irene Calloway? Why had her name disappeared from official citations for 2 decades? What had happened to the woman who authored multiple operational doctrines but appeared in no archives? The headlines weren't dramatic. They were surgical. The Forgotten Strategist, Re-examining Military Authorship. Invisible Ink. How a retired colonel reclaimed her doctrine. No accusations yet, but plenty of curiosity. And with curiosity came witnesses. Over the following week, I began receiving letters. Physical ones handwritten in the kind of cursive the world was starting to forget. Some were from officers I hadn't seen in 30 years. Others were from junior analysts who had once studied my frameworks without knowing I existed. Ma'am, I was trained using your evacuation pattern. It saved lives. I always wondered why it didn't have a name. I served under your logistics model in '09. We called it the Phantom Draft because no one knew where it came from. Now I do. Some of the messages came anonymously. One arrived in a flat envelope, no return address, no message, just a printed copy of a training doctrine. ISR D7 rotations, with my original handwritten notes in the margins. I stared at those notes. My shorthand, my phrases, the faded blue ink where I'd scratched in too vulnerable on rear flank, shift model eastward. It had once been mine. Then it had been buried. Now it had found its way back. I placed the document gently in a binder and labeled the tab Recovered. I wasn't angry anymore. I was reclaiming, and that was different. Later that week, my phone buzzed. An unusual event. Most of the people who texted me were nurses reminding me of appointments or Vega checking in about coffee. But this time, the sender was Derek. Let's fix this together. Come home for dinner. 7 words, polished, measured, familiar in the way that high-ranking officers often try to make amends without ever using the word sorry. But this wasn't a misstep. This wasn't a misunderstanding. He had built a career on a foundation he knew didn't belong to him. He didn't just inherit a legacy, he stole one. I stared at the message for a long while. The screen dimmed and lit up again before I responded. I typed just one word. Home. That was it. Not because I needed to wound him, but because I wanted him to sit with the weight of what that word meant, what he had made it mean. He had turned home into a building he put me in and walked away from. But I remembered a different kind of home, one where ideas were born beside sleeping children, where notes were scribbled in the quiet hours between deployments, where truth didn't need a platform. It just needed to exist. And that truth, it had returned. Not because I raised my voice, but because I refused to stay erased. When I agreed to dinner at Derek's house, I didn't do it for reunion. I did it for recognition. Not the kind that comes with headlines or speeches, just the quiet truth of standing in a place that once called itself home and seeing it for what it had become, not what I'd tried to believe it still was. Derek's message had been brief. Let's fix this together. Come home for dinner. But the truth was, he wasn't inviting me home. He was inviting me into a carefully staged performance, one last attempt to reclaim control of the narrative before it slipped entirely into the hands of truth. Still, I accepted, because sometimes the only way to let something go is to walk into it one last time. The house hadn't changed. Same beige siding, same too-silent entryway. But this time I noticed things I'd overlooked before. The doorbell had been replaced. Sleeker, newer, almost sterile. The porch swing was gone. The framed photo of Derek's commissioning day still hung in the hallway, but there was no trace of the woman who had ironed his uniform that morning. It was as if I'd never been part of this house at all. The table was set beautifully, not warmly, beautifully. Polished flatware, perfectly folded napkins, wine glasses gleaming under recessed lights. A vase of fresh lilies too perfect to have been spontaneous sat at the center like a centerpiece at a diplomatic dinner. On the stove, I caught the faint scent of rosemary, one of my old favorites. Marissa greeted me at the door with the kind of smile you reserve for someone important, but inconvenient. "You look—" "Well," she said, eyes flicking to the uniform jacket I hadn't removed yet. "Thank you," I replied. She led me in like an event coordinator, motioning me to sit at the table. Derek appeared a moment later, awkward in his movements, like a man unsure if he was hosting a mother or negotiating with a witness. "Hi, Mom," he said. The words stumbled out like a foreign language. I nodded. We sat. The food was beautiful. Lemon roasted, chicken garlic, green beans, scalloped potatoes. All familiar, all perfectly plated. But as I took a bite, I realized something strange. None of it tasted like anything. There was no warmth in it. No memory. Just arrangement. The three of us chewed in orchestrated silence, each pretending to belong in the same room. "I thought it would be good to reconnect," Derek said, clearing his throat. "A lot's happened lately." "Yes," I said. "Truth has a way of surfacing, doesn't it?" He glanced down, then busied himself pouring wine. Marissa maintained her composure like a diplomat avoiding escalation. Then came the knock on the door. Derek blinked. "Were we expecting someone?" He opened the door slowly. A neighbor stood on the porch, mid-40s, warm face, casual sweater. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," she said quickly, eyes darting behind Derek's shoulder. "But I just had to say something." She turned to me. "You're Derek's mother, aren't you? I saw you on television. The speech. It gave me chills. I never knew. I just wanted to say thank you." The silence at the dinner table became a vacuum. Marissa froze, hand mid-air with a fork full of salad. Derek forced a smile that crumbled at the edges. "Appreciate that," he said briskly, stepping out to close the door behind him. When he returned, the air had shifted. Marissa reached for her wine hand, trembling slightly. Derek didn't speak. No one did. I took a slow breath, then reached into my purse. From it, I pulled out a photograph. Creased at the corners, the color faded with time. I unfolded it carefully and placed it on the table between us. It was the only picture we'd ever taken together as a full family. Derek was 9. Marissa sat beside me, younger, brighter, not yet dulled by image management. I was in my service fatigues, holding Derek's shoulder gently. We looked like a family, but that was the last time it had been true. I tapped the photo lightly. "This," I said, "was the last time we were still a family. Everything after this has just been a reenactment." They said nothing. Marissa looked away. Derek stared at the photograph, jaw clenched. I stood. "I came tonight," I said quietly, "not to return, but to understand how far I've gone." Derek opened his mouth, closed it again. I looked at the photo one last time before slipping it back into my purse. "You didn't just remove me from this house," I continued, my voice even. "You removed me from the history of it." I walked slowly toward the door. At the threshold, I turned back. Just once. "My name was erased from the records," I said, "but not from the memory of those who served with me." I paused. "And now I've finally done the same." Derek frowned slightly. "What do you mean I met his eyes?" "His mother's eyes. Without anger, without triumph. Just truth. You erased me from this home," I said softly. "I've only just now removed your name from my heart." And then I left. Not because I was done grieving, but because I had finally stopped waiting to be welcomed back. The night I returned from Derek's house, the air felt unusually clear. No bitterness followed me back. No sadness trailed behind my steps. Just a quiet certainty That strange, clean feeling you get after closing a door you should have closed years ago. I wasn't walking away from anything. I was walking into what I had earned. When the driver dropped me at the facility's entrance, Vega was already waiting near the doorway, her back straight, her coat zipped high against the autumn wind. She didn't speak right away, just opened the door and fell into step beside me as we walked down the hall. "How was it?" she asked after a moment. "Staged," I said, "like a play where everyone had forgotten their lines." She didn't press further. That's one of the things I appreciated about Vega. She didn't need emotional reports. She measured truth by action, not sentiment. Back in my room, I removed my jacket, took off my shoes, and sat at the edge of the bed, the old photograph from earlier. Of our family's last real moment. Was still in the drawer. I didn't reach for it. I didn't need to anymore. Instead, I turned to the desk where my binder sat, a heavy, well-worn file stuffed with witness statements, timeline reconstructions, training files, and now the final piece, the Echo Protocol Summary Report. Vega pulled up her laptop and opened the secure interface. "We're ready to submit," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. The submission wasn't just a form. It was a historical correction process. A rare procedural request under military internal review protocol. We had compiled everything, the 8 sworn declarations from former officers, each confirming that I had authored the field model now known as the Callaway construct. And not just that. I had field tested it, refined it, and trained others to use it years before the doctrine appeared under my son's name. Included in the submission was the digital file Vega had unearthed, an audio recording I'd made on a satellite line during an early deployment. You could hear the urgency in my voice, the noise of rotor blades in the background, me explaining the doctrine's rotating defense cycle, the non-binary deployment zones, the emergency alternation algorithm I'd devised after an ambush compromised our perimeter. That voice, tired, determined, was unmistakably mine. Time-stamped, archived, then buried. Until now. Vega uploaded everything into the encrypted ecosystem connected directly to the Department of Strategic Doctrines archival servers. We watched as the screen ran its diagnostics, verifying witness files, complete, validating audio recording integrity, complete, matching doctrinal structure to original schema. 97.3% linguistic match confirmed, reinstatement request code generated, status under review. A simple notification flashed at the bottom of the screen. Authorship claim filed I. Callaway. Status. Pending doctrinal review board. No applause, no flags waving, just a quiet system acknowledgement. But I sat back in my chair, and for the first time in years, I exhaled without a weight on my chest. The next morning, an email came in from Vega's contact within the internal board. It was the preliminary hearing memo. An unlisted meeting scheduled with no external access. 7 officials. Private transcripts. Closed doors. But we would be included in the post-review summary. They called it Correctional Evaluation of Strategic Framework Provenance. Military language for, we might have messed up. Let's check who actually wrote this thing. Inside that meeting, something happened I never expected to read. A young general, fresh-faced someone I'd never met, stood during the briefing and asked a simple, devastating question. If we approve this correction, we're not just editing an archive. We're admitting we've trained generations on material without crediting its author. Are we prepared to answer for that? For a moment, the transcript showed silence. Not an objection, not confusion, just silence. The kind that happens when no one can deny what's been in front of them all along. Then one of the older committee members, Ret General Strathmore, who'd served during my tenure, spoke up. "We didn't teach the wrong doctrine. We just failed to teach the full truth. That ends now." The vote passed 6-1, 1 abstained, none opposed. 2 days later, the formal archive revision was published. Quietly, internally, a single line added at the bottom of the Callaway Construct official document, authored by Colonel Irene Callaway Return. Strategic Development, verified. 2005 Doctrine status. Reinstated to original attribution. Just like that, a ghost became a name again. Back at the facility, Vega printed out the confirmation notice and handed it to me like it was a medal. I didn't frame it. I didn't put it on the wall. I simply folded it and placed it inside my binder, between the witness letters and my own notes from decades past. It wasn't proof of who I was. It was just a receipt for what they could no longer deny. That evening, Vega joined me for tea in the common room. The sun had just begun to fall behind the trees outside, casting long shadows across the tile. "You know," she said, gently stirring her cup, "this changes things." I nodded. "For them, not for me. You could take it further. Publicly, legally." She didn't have to say the word. Sue, Derek, Marissa, the department. They were all viable targets now. The proof was on my side. But I looked at her, then back at the quiet paper beside me. "I don't want courtrooms," I said. "I don't want cameras or settlements. Then what do you want?" I took a sip of tea before answering. "I want this to be taught correctly," I said. "That's all. No headlines, no grudges, just a generation of cadets reading the truth without knowing it was ever in question." Vega smiled. "That sounds like you." I smiled too. "I hope so," I said, because for a long time I wasn't sure anyone still remembered. We sat in silence for a while after that. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because finally the right things had been said in the right places. And that was enough. Some reckonings happen with a bang, headlines, trials, thunderclaps of justice. Mine didn't. Mine came quietly, like truth often does. The investigation into Derek was swift and internal. There were no cameras, no press releases, no public apologies. But inside the Pentagon's higher floors, his name had been moved. Not erased, just set down. He was officially suspended from promotion eligibility for 5 years. Not demoted and not discharged, but marked. For someone like Derek, that was worse than punishment. It meant he would remain exactly where he was, seen but no longer rising. A man whose brilliance had been shadowed by truth he tried to bury. A man others would nod at in hallways but never trust behind closed doors again. I never asked for that. I never needed it. What mattered to me had already happened. The record was corrected. The doctrine carried my name again, and the silence that had swallowed my work had been broken. Not with shouting, but with fact. Still it caught up to him. One afternoon my phone rang. I recognized the number before I picked it up. Derek. His voice was quieter this time. Not cautious like before, not performative. Just small, worn. The way someone sounds when they've finally stopped rehearsing. "I know you don't owe me anything," he said. "And maybe I shouldn't have called, but..." He paused. "Mom," he said again, and this time it didn't sound like a title. It sounded like a question. "I don't understand how you lived like that. Being erased. Being doubted. How did you survive it?" I let the silence stretch. Not out of cruelty, but out of care. I wanted him to hear the space between the question and the answer. I wanted him to feel what it meant to live in that space for years. Then slowly I spoke. "I lived by holding on to things you never had to touch," I said. "Solitude, endurance, and loyalty to the truth, even when no one stood beside it." He didn't say anything for a while. I could hear the strain in his breath. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he whispered. I didn't respond to that. I didn't need to. Because forgiveness isn't always a door. Sometimes it's a window you open for yourself, and sometimes it's one you walk away from entirely. 2 weeks later, Vega handed me a small brown envelope that had been dropped off anonymously at the front desk. No name, no return address. Just my name scrawled in tight block letters on the front. Inside, I found something unexpected. A small metal badge, military-style polished brass, the kind worn during formal briefings. On it, engraved in bold, serif font, were the words, Callaway Doctrine, Strategic Author. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't official issue. It was personal. Beneath the badge was a folded piece of paper torn at the edges, the handwriting slanted and uneven. They won't forget again. Not if I have to teach them myself. No signature. But I didn't need one. I held the badge in my palm for a long moment. The weight wasn't much. An ounce at most. But it carried years. Years of absent silence and the invisible scaffolding that had once supported others while I remained behind the curtain. I smiled softly. Then, without ceremony, I reached for my jacket and slipped the badge into the inner pocket on the left side, where my military ID had once rested during deployments. The place closest to the heart. Not to wear, not to display, but to carry. Later that evening, Vega joined me by the garden outside the facility. The air was crisp, and the last of the leaves drifted lazily down from the oaks. She noticed the slight bulge in my coat. "You keeping it?" she asked. I nodded. She didn't say anything more. She just sat beside me, pulling her coat tighter, and we watched the wind scatter dry leaves across the stone path. Derek had resigned his commission the following week. Not out of compulsion. His record was still technically intact, but out of choice. He'd applied to volunteer for a civilian support unit overseas logistical aid training in post-conflict regions, rebuilding what systems had collapsed. It wasn't a redemption arc. It wasn't noble. But it was something. He didn't call to say goodbye. I didn't expect him to. But I imagined him boarding the plane with a duffel and a binder of doctrine he now taught with the correct name on it. Maybe someday he would share that badge with someone else. Maybe not. It didn't matter. Because I hadn't done this to change him. I had done it to remember myself. And now, when young officers reviewed that strategy, when they traced the lines of a theory built for gray zones, for uncertain battles, for survival in the unspoken places, they would read a name, Callaway. Not a ghost, not a footnote, but a writer, a mother, a soldier, a survivor. There was no press release when I returned to Fort Hayden. No headlines, no banners, no reunion handshake staged for the media. But to me, walking through the front gates of the academy felt like the softest kind of victory. One that didn't announce itself, but made its presence known just the same. 25 years earlier, I'd stood in the same front office, a binder full of doctrine proposals in hand, asked to apply for an instructional position. I was told, politely of course, that I was overqualified for the teaching environment, and perhaps better suited for advisory roles outside of academia. But the truth, I hadn't been what they wanted to see. Too experienced. Too direct. Too much memory in my eyes. Now I returned not as a guest, but as an appointed instructor. My first steps inside the administrative building were met with quiet nods. No one brought up the past. They didn't need to. There's a language in military circles that requires no words. A simple shift of posture, an extra beat of silence in greeting. That was enough. They gave me an office on the second floor near the back. Small. Sunlit in the morning. It had one window, one desk, and the faint scent of old textbooks and ironed uniforms. I didn't ask for anything else. I brought only one photo, the snapshot of my last unit, the one before everything turned. I placed it on the shelf, not as decoration, but as a compass. A reminder that the past didn't need to be rewritten, just remembered with honesty. The first few weeks were slow. My students were quiet, respectful. Some of them knew my name from the corrected doctrine in their syllabus. Others whispered rumors in the halls. A few came in skeptical, watching me as if I might teach like a ghost, hovering just above the history they'd barely been told. I didn't force anything. Instead, I lectured with clarity, taught frameworks, asked questions, waited for answers, corrected with precision, not performance. Slowly, the room began to shift. They stopped whispering. They started listening. By mid-semester, I had a full seminar on asymmetrical response planning, a capstone group dissecting the Callaway construct from its early origins to its battlefield adaptations, and several cadets who stayed after class just to ask about real-life applications. One afternoon, after a particularly intense discussion on chain-of-command failure, a cadet lingered near the whiteboard. He was 19, maybe 20, lean, sharp-eyed, still carrying the weight of wanting to prove himself. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he asked, "if I can ask, what was the hardest thing for you after combat?" I paused. It wasn't the first time I'd been asked that question in some form. Usually I brushed it aside. But this time felt different. He wasn't asking for gossip or dramatics. He genuinely wanted to understand. So I answered. "Living," I said. "Living without losing who I was." He didn't write it down. He just nodded. And that, I think, meant more than anything. Weeks passed. Then months. The academy's halls became familiar again. Not in the way they once were, but in a new rhythm. I passed students who stood a little taller, colleagues who spoke less cautiously. People began leaving books at my door with sticky notes that said, "Would love your thoughts." It wasn't reverence I earned. It was relevance. For the first time in decades, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, not correcting the past, but building the future. At the end of the semester, we took a group photo, my final seminar. 12 cadets, no formal uniforms, just posture and presence. We stood shoulder to shoulder, no one in front, no one behind. I stood in the middle, not as a leader, just as part of the circle. That photo went on my desk. I didn't frame it in gold, just a simple black frame from the campus bookstore. But every morning when I sat down, I looked at it and reminded myself I didn't fight to be seen. I fought to make sure the truth didn't vanish. Then came my birthday. It was a quiet day. No classes. I didn't tell anyone. I'd never been one for celebrations, especially in a world where recognition had always been a battlefield. When I returned from lunch, a small white box was sitting on my desk. No card, no note on the outside, just a tight red ribbon tied with deliberate care. I opened it slowly. Inside was a small cake, a single layer. Vanilla with dark chocolate shavings. On top, piped in thin blue script, were 3 words: General. Mother. Strategist. No signature. But I didn't need one. Because this wasn't a gift of apology, it was acknowledgement. A quiet offering. Not loud enough to undo history, but honest enough to recognize it. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I placed it gently on the edge of the desk. I didn't call anyone, didn't photograph it, didn't post about it. I took out a small plate, cut a thin slice, sat in my chair. No music, no candles, no speeches. Just the warm, golden sunlight drifting through the window, casting soft shadows across my hands. I took the first bite. It tasted like quiet, like peace, like presence. After a while, I opened the inner pocket of my jacket and slipped the photo of the class inside, right next to the strategic badge I'd received months earlier. Not for safekeeping, for continuity. Because everything I had given, everything I had lost, everything I had reclaimed, none of it lived in headlines or in revenge. It lived here, in this room, at this table, built not to elevate me, but to welcome those who had once been forgotten like I had. I didn't return for glory. I returned so that no one could erase me again. Not because I forced them to remember me, but because I never stopped remembering myself. Have you ever felt like your name was forgotten in the very place you helped build? Irene's story isn't just about reclaiming recognition. It's about what happens when a woman chooses quiet strength over noise, when she stops waiting to be welcomed and instead builds her own space of truth. If this story touched something in you, mamant. If you've ever felt overlooked, erased, or quietly strong in the face of silence, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What part of Irene's journey spoke to you most? Let us know below. You're not alone, and if you'd like to hear more stories like this, of resilience, quiet power, and emotional truth, subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new episode.